Greetings, welcome back. Today we are in Mark chapter 4, and in this video we are talking about the first 20 verses of Mark 4. Now, to begin with, when we look at this section, we notice that Jesus is in the same situation that he was in Mark 3, and that is he's down by the seashore. A large crowd is gathering around him, and he is forced to get into a boat. Now, if you remember back in Mark 1, we talked about Jesus as the healer, the exorcist, and the teacher. So here we are in Mark 3 and Mark 4, where those same three roles are drawing huge crowds. So what started off as a very local event where Jesus was healing a few people and teaching in the local synagogue has now blossomed into large crowds following Jesus to the point where he has to escape the push of the crowds by getting into a boat and kind of pushing out into the sea away from people where they can't press up on him. We also notice that even though teaching was really the first thing we see Jesus do when he enters the synagogue, he teaches. At least we're told he's teaching, but this is the first time that we actually see Jesus teaching anything. And the first thing we see him teach is a parable. Now, it is important as we go through this parable to understand it as a parable about the kingdom of God, the reign of God that Jesus is trying to inaugurate. But it's also important to understand that just because Jesus gives us one interpretation does not mean that there could not be other significant elements that Jesus doesn't talk about. It is possible to find new or somewhat new interpretations in parables, but at the same time, we must remember that if our interpretation of the parable does not align with Jesus' view of the kingdom of God, we can pretty well understand that we are getting the interpretation wrong. So, Jesus talks about a sower going through the field, somebody sowing seed, throwing seed out into the field, and how that seed then grows or does not grow. It's important to remember that the sower is unimportant here. A lot of commentators will talk about who is this sower, and while you can make some claims, I guess, because again, Jesus doesn't give us the whole interpretation, there's really less importance placed on the person sowing the seed than there is on the seed and the results. So, identifying the person sowing is not as important as identifying the seed. It's also important to notice that the sower isn't necessarily being wasteful with this seed, throwing it all through all kinds of ground. If you look at even modern planting techniques, there's always some places where the farmer plants a few stalks of corn off to the side, and that's even with the GPS signals and everything else that they use. So we can't fault this man for broadcast sowing and having some places where it did not grow. Again, the sower is not terribly important. What is important is how we understand the seed. So the first thing to notice is that Jesus, unlike so many other parables, Jesus gives us an interpretation. He tells us what it means that the birds came and pecked the seed off the path. He tells us somewhat what it means to be in the rocky soil. He tells us what it means to grow up in thorns and thistles. He gives us the interpretation. Why? Because Jesus says to his disciples, you are in a position where you don't just hear the parable and have to go away and wonder what I meant. You get to come to me and find the meaning. And that's where we should start focusing, is not in the interpretation, but we should start with, what does it mean to be Jesus's disciple? What does it mean that Jesus gives us this interpretation where everyone else has to go away, go home, and try to figure out what it means on their own? That's an important lesson for us, because it seems like so many people were coming to Jesus for healings, for exorcisms, for other things. They weren't coming to actually learn from Jesus and grow with Jesus. They were trying to either use him for healing and their own gains, or else they were coming to him because he was a curiosity. He was somebody who was drawing crowds, and crowds draw crowds. So people saw, oh, Jesus is popular. I'm going to go out and see what it's all about. And those people who were coming to Jesus for the wrong reasons seem like they're the ones who they have to go away and meditate on what he's saying in the hopes that maybe they will come back. The disciples, though, represent not just the 12, they represent all the followers of Jesus, where Jesus is going to, for those people who follow him and listen to him, he's going to take the time to help them understand. He doesn't want his followers to simply be in the dark or have to rely on their own understanding. He wants them to experience life with him, and so he's going to help them understand the parable. Um, and this parable is one that is, well, it's a little bit tricky in that even though Jesus gives us this wonderful description of um, the seed falling on the path is the hardened heart, or the rocks, where it grows fast but then withers, is somebody who hears the message, but then that um, it doesn't take root, and then the weeds choking it out, where the the wheat grows, the grain grows, but it doesn't produce anything. In other words, you still see the stalk, but it never has enough energy, never has enough resources to fruit and thus produce grain. Those we see this progression from the worst to the best of those uh, lives, and then we see Jesus progress through producing grain. In other words, all of this is a progression from the worst possible outcome of hearing Jesus' message to the best possible outcome of hearing Jesus' message. And we have to ask, because he never tells us. So he gives us that explanation and talks to us about what it means for the seed to fall here versus here versus here. But we never know, is Jesus talking about individual people? In other words, some people? Or is this something that we can apply to our own hearts and say, you know, the gospel hits some of my heart and it produces abundantly, but when it hits other parts, it doesn't produce at all. And I need to spend more time cultivating those parts of my heart. That's what I mean way back when I said that there can be multiple interpretations to some degree. This is one of those areas where Jesus kind of leaves it open and doesn't really say who or how these individual or how these soil types relate to individual people versus within our own lives. You know, and another question he doesn't really answer is what are we to make of some of these? Like, you know, um, the people who don't produce fruit. What are we to do with stalks that grow but don't produce fruit? What are we to do? What are we to do with people with this rocky soil? Does this mean that individuals have shaped their own destiny and haven't cultivated their soil properly, and that with cultivation they can grow? And if so, how does that relate to us? In other words, what Jesus is doing is showing us a baseline picture of what the parable means. He's giving us a basic interpretation, and then that basic interpretation is supposed to lead us to all kinds of questions about, well, what does that mean for me? What does it mean that maybe the person near me hears the gospel, likes the gospel, understands it, but their lives and their lifestyles are choking out the gospel message? What am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to interact with that as somebody who wants to take this message seriously and wants to produce fruit. What does it mean that this person over here is hearing the gospel enthusiastically, but they're going to dry out because they don't really have the roots, they don't have the depth? What does that mean for me who wants to produce fruit? The idea that we can just leave people and say, oh, well, they didn't hear, or they didn't understand, or the gospel wasn't for them. That I don't think that is the kind of mentality Jesus wants us to develop through this parable. I do think that he does want his disciples to understand why certain people aren't following. He wants the disciples who are going along with Jesus through all of his journeys. He wants them to understand, hey, this person came for a little bit and then flamed out. This person wanted to come along. They seem enthusiastic, but every time we turn around, they're gone. And these people over here, they're just not listening. I think he did want his initial disciples to understand why people weren't with them, but I don't think he wanted the disciples to just then give up on the people around them. So that's the basis of this. I do think that it's worth some time spending some more time in this, because a parable, by definition, is something you're supposed to read again and again and again, and then think about and actually try to place into your own life. This is why Jesus gives the quote from Isaiah: hearing, they will not hear, seeing, they will not see. This idea is that we are supposed to meditate on the parable. Jesus wants us to recognize that the people who are going to follow him the most closely are the ones who are going to meditate on what he says and not just hear it once and walk away. The crowds that would have heard him once, gone, this guy doesn't make sense, and then walked away, are the people who hear without hearing. And what Jesus wants from us is to hear until we understand. Listen to it until we get it, and until we understand something that makes sense with the overall picture of who Jesus is. Anyway, I hope that blesses you today. As always, if you have comments or questions about Mark 4, please let me know. I have lots of ways to get a hold of me. I would love to deal with questions or comments. So until next time, God bless.